I want to welcome John Dines, who is product manager for Origin Effects, and we are extremely grateful to have his time today to talk about Origin in general and what really makes them different from a design standpoint, from their product portfolio standpoint. So we're going to have a lot of great conversation, particularly about their three big areas of effects, which are compressors, amp recreations, and then adaptive pedals. And I think personally, I'm extremely jazzed to talk about the adaptive pedals. The Halcyon Gold, the Halcyon Green are two of my favorite pedals they have in their line. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn it over to John real quick for just a quick 15, 20-second intro, and then we're going to get right into some discussion here. If you've got questions throughout the event, feel free to throw those out. You should be able to put those into the chat or into the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to all of those as we go through the event. So, John, I'm going to turn it over to you, man.
Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thanks for turning up. My name's John Dines. I'm the product manager at Origin Effects, and I suppose what that means is I have to be the middleman between the customer that buys the pedal and the engineers that design it. So, in one direction, I'm kind of taking everything that customers say they want from pedals or problems that they're trying to solve, that kind of thing, turning that into a brief that the engineers and the design guys can work with. And in the opposite direction, taking the cool ideas that the designers and engineers have and trying to turn that into something that's going to be useful and understandable to the average guitar playing member of the public. I've been at Origin Effects nearly 4 years, with a background in working as a musician and a recording engineer / producer in a sort of modest capacity, and also been in the guitar industry at other companies before.
That's awesome, man. It sounds like you juggle a lot of balls. That's what it sounds like in terms of all the different things you have to do from that perspective. So I'm assuming you're talking to customers a lot in terms of getting feedback about products and market trends and things like that.
Well, sort of whether directly or indirectly. I mean, I do all the trade show stuff, so it's really good to go to those things and talk to people face to face. And occasionally when I get to, I'll do kind of in-store visits and meet shop staff and sort of find out what they don't understand about the products and take feedback from them and everything. But also I spend more time than I'd like to admit kind of scouring forum discussions and looking at reviews and YouTube comments and that kind of thing. And if there's something that keeps coming up, I probably have to make a note of it and turn it into a suggestion or a design brief or something like that.
Yeah. Well, and the thing I think I'm most appreciative of is that you're a true gear nerd like the rest of us. And I've seen you play in videos. You're a great guitar player as well. So I'm sure that kind of brings things full circle. Well, let's talk really quickly. Yeah. Let's talk really quickly. Just the history and background of Origin, and some of the folks joining us here today, you may know a good bit about Origin, or they may just be beginning sort of their journey to understand you guys and what your pedals are. So maybe just give us a quick overview of where you guys started, what your MO is, and kind of what you're seeing the company direction in the future.
Okay, well, like most sort of boutique pedal brands, Origin Effects started with kind of one man in a shed building something that he really wanted to use, and that man is Simon Keats, who started Origin Effects back, or rather launched the first Origin Effects pedal back in 2012. He's an electronic engineer with a background at Vox, Korg. He's done some stuff for Focusrite and other kind of British, more high-end pro audio brands. Very knowledgeable bloke. And really, it all started because he was repairing some URI 1176 compressors for somebody. And while he had them in his workshop, he was trying to get the Lowell George slide tone from the Little Feat records, which he's a massive fan of, along with other sort of Southern rock stuff. Is really kind of his bag. And basically found this sound with these two studio units and thought, right, this is it. This is the amazing thing, and tried to recreate it with pedals and just couldn't do it. So ended up designing a pedal that did it, which is the original Origin Effects slide rig, which morphed into the Cali 76. It's a sort of necessity is the mother of invention kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then, you know, as things usually go, people found out about it and wanted them, and you know, the sort of demand outstripped his ability to build the things, and then a company grew out of it, and here we are. But that's kind of where it comes from, is one quite sort of fussy and particular man who knows what he's doing, trying to either recreate vintage sounds or sort of overcome problems that he doesn't think have been adequately done yet or done to his tastes. And it, you know, it becomes a pedal. And luckily, enough other people agree that it's something they want to hear, and they're out there buying them. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of it.
Well, what I've learned about Simon is, I mean, I think he's probably one of those people in the top 1% that can literally hear the difference in, every little component, and that the attention to detail is really there. And maybe if you could talk a little bit more around, how it evolved from that original slide rig, and how the product line expanded, and just sort of what approach Simon takes when he's thinking about a new product.
Um, well, I suppose the way that the product range grew in the first place, as is often the case with sort of smaller firms and enthusiastic designers, is just constantly wanting to improve on the thing that already exists. I think it's quite a big company thing to kind of just come out of the gate with a whole range of things and go, this is it, and run those until you completely replace them with something entirely different. Like, that's not really how boutique firms tend to do things at the beginning, just for a start, because you don't have the resources. So
Right.
every kind of iteration of the Cali 76 was just Simon thinking, oh, I've had another good idea. What if we added this? Maybe we could do that with it. And, you know, you get the transformer balanced one, and the stuff with the parallel circuit and the germanium boost, and all of those things is just, yeah, him kind of like adding more heads to the Frankenstein's monster. And and I suppose when you're a smaller brand, you have requests from artists and things, and you can kind of incorporate all of that. And then it got to a point where he wanted to do the same thing with amp sounds. Like, he's a massive vintage amp nut. He's got a pretty impressive collection of various things, particularly old Marshalls, but also lots of Fender stuff, and slightly more unusual things like old Laney super groups, and more like his living room has basically got Marshall 4x12s for wallpaper. And you know, he's just one of those guys. If there's a sound that he likes, especially from the sort of golden era of rock music, he wants to know what it is that makes it tick, and then understand that, and it will probably end up as a pedal prototype. Whether or not it sees the light of day is a different thing, but
No.
it's if there's something that kind of captures his imagination, he just wants to work out what makes it tick.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to zoom in there, and I'm going to do this selfishly because I'm a huge Marshall nut as well. And I don't know if you can. There's just barely the edge over here, but I've got a couple of vintage Marshalls. I've got a 73, a 77, an SLX, and I've also got a Jubilee. But one of my favorite pedals you guys make is the Revival Drive. And the HR too, the hot rod version as well is
Mm-hmm.
really cool. And I know that's sort of an iteration of the circuit. But let's talk really quickly around your sort of approach to amp recreations, because you guys are doing a lot of different things versus other people in the market in terms of how those drive pedals are approached. So could you just walk us through that really quickly?
I suppose the simple way to describe it would be, if you want to recreate the sound of an amp, you basically have to recreate the whole amp, which is what the Revival Drive pedals are doing. Inside those pedals, albeit not using tubes, you've got the whole circuit from a vintage non-master volume amp. Well, or actually, you've got it twice because there's two channels. So there's the preamp, the power amp, the phase inverter, power supply. In the larger Revival Drive pedal, the two channel one, there's the power supply ghosting. There's different stuff you can mess around with bright caps. So it's really just a question of if you want it to sound like an amp, it kind of needs to be as much like an amp as possible, just shrunk in miniature and done quite cleverly using transistors rather than tubes. But yeah, it's all in there. And I suppose the real details and where kind of Simon excels is recreating the interplay between all of those circuit elements.
Mm.
So as you crank up a non-master volume amp and you just sort of turn the thing up louder and it starts to distort, different parts of the circuit will distort at different times. So the power tubes will go first, then the phase inverter, then the preamp, and they'll all distort in different ways and add their own different kind of harmonics and clipping character. And it's the way that it kind of progresses through that kind of scale of overdrive that gives you the sort of character and personality of those old amps. And of course, because you're putting a constantly varying waveform into that circuit, it's not just a question of, oh, when you play loudly or turn your guitar all the way up, everything's distorting. And when you turn it down, it's just the power amp. It's happening really intricately all through the duration of the whole waveform. And that's how amps get that character.
Yeah.
And in the larger revival drive, there's some really ridiculous lengths that have been gone to recreate that stuff. So I mentioned the ghosting in the amp. So if anybody watching that doesn't know what ghosting is, as you demand more and more from an amp's power supply, the filtering in the power supply that takes the kind of 60, well, your viewers will be American, so it'll be 60 cycle hum out of the power supply. You're basically taking sorry, I'll start again. You're demanding so much from the power supply that the filtration doesn't work. So you just pull that 60 cycle hum straight into the audio path. And you end up with this kind of intermodulation between the note you're playing and the note that's coming from the power supply, which should be being filtered out, but it's not because you're demanding too much. So in Simon's design for the revival drive, you can vary how much ghosting is taking place. And on the back of it, there's even a switch to select between whether it's happening at 60 hertz, like in the US, or 50 hertz in Europe, which is probably a bit further than most designers would go in making a kind of amp in a box pedal.
Oh, yes, I totally agree. And it's those levels of detail that I find so interesting about the Origin line, because I mean, that is super nerd kind of stuff, right? To literally think about the difference between 50 and 60 hertz. And, you get back to, that only really happens when you push the amp. And again, like with my 73, where I notice that mode is most is single note licks, right? Because you're hearing that kind of come up underneath the note, almost not really like an octave, but almost like this weird pitch up underneath. Again, if anyone has never heard this before, but it is a very unique sound. And I remember the first time I started playing with a revival drive lineup and sort of hearing that and hearing how, even the presence knob, how you guys have it, it's very interesting. Above noon, you have a presence knob like a standard plexi with, a feedback loop. But as you go left, it takes that away, the negative feedback away, to make it more like a Vox type amplifier, which I thought was just so cool. I could literally go on about this all day because again, I mentioned I'm a fanatic as well, but we do have some questions coming in from the audience. I'd love to throw over to you, John. And then we can go into maybe talk about compression. But we've got a question from Daniel, and he says, "Hey, John, let's hear your must-have pedals on your board, and what are they? And if you could tell us more details."
At risk of sounding like a company man, I do have 3 Revival Drive compacts on my board.
3? Wow.
Yeah, the compact ones. I've got them set up like, imagine an 80s rack rig with 3 amps in a rack, and you're switching between them for like a clean crunch and a high gain sound. So I suppose I'd have to say I'd have to keep a Revival Drive compact on there. Strymon stuff, I've got a Timeline and a Big Sky. I think if forced to choose, I'd keep the Timeline, and then the other one, I guess, is the Sonic Research Turbo Tuner.
I love that approach, man. I'm with you. I love the Timeline so much, and it's strange too, because I mean that pedal is, it's almost a decade old, I think, at this point, but it's still just the sort of the bar of which is set for so many others. I love it. The Big Sky's great too, but I'm a delay fan. So good to
Yeah,
hear.
no, they're great. If I can add a fourth one,
Yeah, go for it,
um,
man.
I've got a thing from a guy called Cossack Effects.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Cusack and Mojo Hand, they're together in a group. Yeah, we actually have some of their products.
Cossack, not Cusack.
Oh,
And
Cossack. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
um, yeah, and he makes a clock, not a MIDI clock, nothing like that. It's just a clock, and it's also got a countdown timer and a stopwatch. And that's got to be one of the coolest things on my board because when you're on a gig, it's pretty rude to look at your watch in front of the audience, but you kind of need to be on top of that stuff. And yeah, other guys that I play with, I've noticed them starting looking over at my board to
It's
make sure that we're on track for the set. So it's definitely paying off. He makes a load of cool stuff for MIDI controlling the revival drive, foot switching stuff as well. He's a really clever guy.
That's awesome, man. Well, I learned something today. I had never heard of Cossack. I'll have to go check that out. It could definitely be handy. I know that the new Walrus tuners, you can actually put a clock on there as well, which I know has been helpful. And some people actually, you
Oh,
can
that's
upload
cool.
images. Yeah, and I know some people have actually started putting their set lists onto the image. So when you mute it, you actually have your set list right there, which is kind of cool. Um, well, let's do
That
this.
is that is smart. Welcome to the 21st century.
I know, right? Yeah, it's really cool. The first time we got him in, I don't know, it was probably 6 or 8 months ago. We played around with it. I bought my dad plays guitar too. I bought him one for Christmas and I like uploaded, our company logo on it just to be cute. But you can put anything you want on there. It's really pretty wild. Pretty wild.
Most people are just putting pictures of cats, right?
Most pictures of cats or your girlfriend, whatever, right? But if you want to get, utilitarian, you can put your set list or anything else up there. So let's do this. I'm gonna kind of transition our conversation to compression because I know that's core of what you guys do. 1170, the Cali 76, which is the 1176 remake. But before I do that, I'm just gonna throw a poll out for everybody that's in the webinar. Do you understand compression, or is this sort of a big mysterious black hole? Because I know that it is that way for so many people. So let's just take a couple of seconds. If you answer the question, let us know what you think about compression. If it's something, okay, about 50-50. And the answers here were I know the ways of the compression force, or I am terrified of the black hole abyss. Perfect split between the two here. Okay, so a little bit more rolling in now that say, hey, yeah, I understand compression. So I think we got a nice healthy mix. One thing too, John, it may be your phone. It looks like our video, you went 90-degree turned real quick. I don't know if there's a
Oh,
way
really?
that you
Okay,
can.
it's because the poll has appeared on my screen.
Oh, there you go.
I was
Okay,
just about to apologize and get rid of it, but yeah, we're back in the room.
yeah, there you go. Yeah,
Um,
we're back all good. So yeah, so we'll split maybe 67, 33%, kind of more saying that they really understand compression, some saying they don't. So let's dive into that, man. Can you just kind of give us a quick overview? I know we've already talked about the origins of the pedal because of, Simon's invention of the slide pedal and then how it's evolved, but maybe talk to us a little bit about the new Cali 76 FET and what makes it different from your previous Cali 76 compact.
okay, well, we didn't want to make it too different because the Cali 76 is our bread and butter. But as I was saying earlier, as time goes on, you do find ways of improving things. And the first two real obvious differences between the new Cali 76 FET compressor and bass compressor versus the outgoing compact deluxe and compact bass is they're smaller. So they're now the size of a sort of typical overdrive pedal. In fact, I've got what do I have here? I've got an old stacked edition,
Mm-hmm.
which is the same size as the old enclosure, and a new bass compressor.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
this will now fit on a pedal train nano without the jacks hanging off at the back. And it also now has improved LED metering, which is done in the same way as the old big box Calis, which I'm hoping people will be familiar with. Electronically, there have been some improvements as well. So the older models, if you wanted maximum headroom, you had to run them off of 18 volts. They still work great at 9, but to really get the kind of headroom that's best for running them as line levels, running them for line level signals or, further on down the chain, it was best to run them at 18. The new ones can now be run off of 9 volts, but that will be stepped up internally to 24. So they've got even more headroom at 9 volts than the old ones had at 18. And lastly, the side chain has been changed slightly to be more like the big box pedals. And what that sounds like is just more sort of linearity in the high end. You can put bigger signals into them and it will stay cleaner, especially in the highs and lows. I mean, we're talking quite subtle differences, but if you compare the two side by side, obviously, as I had to quite a lot throughout the process, once you've tried the new one, the older one sounds a little more focused in the mid-range, whereas the newer ones have more extension in the bass and treble frequencies. And this is particularly noticeable if you use them like in the insert of a mixer or as outboard in your DAW and start putting drum loops through them and stuff like that. They kind of, yeah, they sound really broad and hi-fi.
Yeah. Well, and I think that would be important as well, because again, coming back to the utility of a lot of your products, I know a lot of guitar players and a lot of bass players use them on their board, but the quality is, I mean, you literally running out of a DAW, doing a send sort of a receive. I mean, these things are as good as using, real rack gear, which I'm sure a lot of your users, were doing that. I mean, I certainly have before. So the fact that you guys are doing that in such a way where, you've expanded that frequency response, you've got more opportunity to run other instruments like drums and things through, I think was a really big improvement. And I also agree the LEDs are great. I'm such a visual guy. Like anytime, I'm mixing or whatever, I'm always looking at the needle, because compression, again, it's, as a guitar player, I always say I can feel it more than I can hear it, like how my hands kind of react and can feel the difference between compression. But I know that also when you're producing, it's so important to have that visually. So I think that's a great improvement you guys have done. Again, coming back to this idea of compression being a bit of a black box for some people, can you maybe give us a quick description of how a lot of your users and even artists, because I know you've got a lot of great artists line up, including I think David Gilmour is using the Cali 76, if I've got that right, or has used the Cali 76. So if you could just tell us a little bit about how artists are approaching it in their rig and really how to fundamentally integrate it into what you're doing.
Well, I mean, because it is a sort of essentially a studio grade compressor, there are a lot of ways that it can be used. I think the thing with the artists of ours who are using it is it tends to be people who do kind of get studio compression. So they're using it because they want to do that more controlled, maybe more subtle stuff, and have total command over what's happening in the compression part of their signal chain. And we're talking people who've obviously spent a lot of time in studios, right? So I've probably had an 1176 on their guitar at some point in a studio setting and gone, I want to take that on the road. So it's still a compressor pedal in guitar rigs. So I suspect 9 out of 10 people have got it first in the chain or first in the chain after vintage fuzz and wah pedals that don't work after buffers. But the good thing about it is you can kind of have it in that sort of signal conditioning position in the chain without it really steamrolling everything too much further down the line. Well, and having said that, some people do use it at the end of the chain to kind of just sweeten things up a bit and have the kind of studio sheen effect. Yeah. It's versatile, so it can kind of be used wherever.
I would love to hear your thoughts on putting it last. And I will tell you, I'm one of those psychopaths that enjoys doing that. And one of the reasons I enjoy it is, I like my overdrives to really respond to my hands. And so putting them ahead of a compressor allows that to still happen. Whereas, and again, if you're kind of new to compression, you're making loud things quieter, you're making quieter things louder, right? So it's evening out sort of the dynamics of the signal. So if you put it in front of an overdrive, it can do weird things. You can also use it as a boost, which I've done that before as well. Having a little bit of compression, use it as a boost, drive your drives harder. But can you kind of talk about those three scenarios? So what are the benefits of having in front? What are the benefits of using as a boost? What are the benefits of using at the end of the chain?
Yeah, of course. I mean, as it happens, I'm the same as you. So I like to run my compressor later in my signal chain for the reason that you just said. But I'll go into that in a second, and I'll kind of go with the normal version first. So the reason that you'd run a compressor at the front of the chain is because you want it to have an effect on the dynamics of your instrument. So I suppose we're taking two different approaches. We either want it to make our guitar sound different, or we want it to make our electric guitar tone sound different, if you see what I mean. Running it at the front of the chain is almost making it sound like your instrument is physically reacting differently when you're doing things to it. So we're not just talking about evening out the sort of poor playing technique of the right hand, which is what a lot of people think. You look in forum discussions and you see people going, I don't need a compressor because I actually practice my picking, which isn't really what it's about at all. It's about doing things to the dynamics of the individual note, stuff that's happening, after the pick's left the string and you've got no more control over it with your technique. So you might want to do things like emphasize the pick attack, or you might want to add sustain that your guitar's not capable of. If you want to run a singing lead sound that isn't too distorted from quite a plinky old Gretsch, you can't do that without manipulating the sustain of the instrument somehow. And the thing people often do is add distortion, but adding compression will do it without the extra overdrive, so you could do stuff like that. Or you could run a really slow attack and a fast release. So the pick attack part of the note gets through uncompressed and is very exaggerated, and then everything else gets clamped down later, like a kind of typical funk or chicken picking sound. Or you might have a kind of quite clean part and the pick attack's sticking out too much. So you want to sort of subdue it and homogenize everything a little more before that hits the overdrive. Because at the point that you hit the overdrive, that's compressing the signal as well in a much cruder way. So they're both just taking a signal that reaches a certain point after which the peaks of the signal get turned down. And a compressor does it by reducing the level of those, and an overdrive does it by just lopping them clean off.
Yep, chop it.
So what you might want to do is keep your guitar signal level at a sort of sweet spot as it hits the overdrive. So it stays right in the good bit of the overdrive and you kind of get a consistent level of drive. And that can be a lovely thing for, like I say, a lead sound that you want overdriven, but not too much, and consistently overdriven for the duration of the note. Kind of typical sort of session lead sound that you might have heard in the 80s or 90s or something like that, but, the sort of more polite end of the lead tone spectrum. Alternatively, if you want to do the opposite, like you or I, you run the compressor near the end of the chain. So if you're somebody that likes to really vary the amount of drive by using your picking technique or by using your guitar volume knob, and you kind of want to go for that vintage amp thing of just, well, I'll turn it up when I want it more distorted and I'll turn it down on my guitar when I want it to clean up. It can be tempting to just kind of strip everything out of your signal chain and just have a sort of amp in a box drive pedal doing that. But you'll still lose volume as you clean up, or at least perceived volume. The peaks might not necessarily be much quieter, but everything underneath is going to kind of change in average volume. So by slapping the compressor after that amp in a box pedal, in my case, the Revival Drive Compact, it evens out that difference between loud and soft. So you can vary the drive and get all of those shades of edge of breakup stuff without it kind of dropping out of the mix and getting lost. So yeah, it can do that thing too.
Which to me is much more of what you would hear in a studio. And for me, like I'm a Logic user, and typically anytime I'm recording guitar tracks, I'm always throwing an 1176, even if it's just for tonal aspects, right? Like even if the needle is barely moving on compression, just that tonal sort of sculpting that it does to a guitar, I love, and it's one of the reasons I enjoy running at the end of my chain. I'm also one, I grew up again playing Marshall, so I never really had a clean channel. So my clean channel was my volume control in my hand, and so by using that compressor at the end, you're still able to roll down and really make when you do pull things down and have a clean tone, you're not losing so much volume that you fade back in the mix, which I think is a lot of fun to use a compressor at the end of the chain. Um,
Yeah.
well, on that note, I'm actually going to launch another quiz here for everyone. And this one particularly, I want to see if people are using compression in their current rig. So let me just launch this new one here. So yeah, just take a second, fill this out real quick. Are you currently using a compressor? Are you not using a compressor? Oh wow, looks so like 100% so far using compression. Let's give it a couple more seconds to see what rolls in. Wow, we are literally like full. Everybody in this meeting, it looks like, is using compression. Yep. Yeah, we're sounds like we've got a lot of folks here that understand and are applying compression, maybe why they're joining today, because you guys are so well known for that. So that's really cool. It's funny because I feel like several years back, I mean, really even a decade ago, it didn't seem like that many people were using compression. And again, having this sort of concept of the black box of compression. I think so many guitar players just didn't get it. They didn't know how to apply it. But it seems that it's really become much more mainstream. So that's interesting to see. Well, any audience questions for John on compression before we move on? I want to talk a little bit about your adaptive pedals as we kind of get ready to wrap up. But if anybody has a question, you can go down to the Q&A button and feel free to throw one in. Give it a couple of seconds to see if anybody throws one over to us. Okay, everybody's good. All right, great. Well, John, let's talk a little bit about your adaptive pedals, particularly, again, the Halcyon gold, green. Where did the concept come up from, and how does the technology make these pedals more responsive than their original variants?
Okay, I suppose the best place to describe this from for anybody that hasn't heard of them is if I talk about the Halcyon Green first.
Yeah.
So what the Halcyon Green is it's a tube screamer style sound. It'd be unfair to call it a clone because there's just so much more going on in it to make this adaptive circuitry work, which I'm about to describe. So with a tube screamer, I'm sure everybody's familiar with that kind of typical tube screamer sound. It's got the mid hump, the bass is rolled off, the treble's rolled off. You've got a load of mid range that's remaining, and it amplifies that and throws that through a kind of soft clipping overdrive circuit. And the reason that that's good is because if you've got an amp that's on the edge of breakup, you don't want to throw a lot of low end into it because it's going to make the amp flub out. You don't want to throw a lot of high end into it because the amp could get harsh. And also you kind of got the potential for feedback and stuff. So it makes a lot of sense for a drive that's boosting an amp to just lop all of that unnecessary stuff off and throw the mid-range up the amp that you're connecting it to, which is all very well and good, unless you're the type of player that you or I seem to be, where we like to kind of do things in shades and use the volume knob and use playing dynamics and stuff like that. And as you start trying to back off that sound, that useful removal of top and bottom end suddenly starts to sound thin because you're no longer boosting the amp.
Yep.
You don't need to remove the bass and the treble, and in fact you start to notice that they're missing. So if you were to run a tube screamer up a deluxe reverb and then clean it right back using the guitar volume knob, it wouldn't sound like your deluxe reverb clean sound. It would sound like your deluxe reverb clean sound with all the bass and treble removed. So what the adaptive circuitry in the Halcyon does is, as you reduce the input signal level, either by playing more softly or by turning your guitar volume down, the pedal begins to drop out of clipping, as an ordinary pedal would do. But as that happens, the bass and treble is reintroduced proportionally. So the more clipping you've got, the more mid-hump you've got. And as it gets totally clean, the pedal gets pretty much totally flat. So you can kind of vary how on the pedal is using your playing dynamics or guitar volume. And I think the reason that that's possibly more important than I'm making it out to be is because how many of us have been down the rabbit hole of like stacking a million low gain overdrives to try and get this like incremental progression from clean to distorted?
Yep. Guilty.
Because nothing ever, like, yeah, exactly. And so am I. So is everybody watching the thing, I imagine, as well. Like you go down this rabbit hole going, oh, when I did that one, it was too much, but when I took it away, it was not enough. And then you try boosting this with that and that with this and all of this stuff. And we sort of narrowed it down to that issue of you just want your clean tone back and you want it sort of constantly variable. So as a result, you can kind of dial in a lot more gain than you would normally do with the tube screamer on the Halcyon without the fear that you're going to be kind of stuck with that tone or treading that line of should the pedal be on, should it be off, and trying to work out that middle ground.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how that works. And it was a lot of work to get it right, which is why it's sort of slightly upsetting when people refer to it as a clone, because it would have been so much easier if it was a clone. And instead, it was like an 18-month hard slog to get this exactly right. And we think we did in the end. Then there's also the Halcyon Gold, which is exactly the same principle applied to the Klon circuit, another famous mid-humpy overdrive with its own character and its own clipping. And yeah, you know, in doing so, we had to also get all the control tapers as close as we could. We had to get the clipping characteristics right. We didn't want to go looking for old NOS diodes that might just dry up at any second. So in the Halcyon Gold, the clipping characteristics of the Klon Centaur have been recreated using modern diodes configured in quite an elaborate way to get the clipping characteristic of the NOS germanium ones that are in the Klon. Like, it's a whole thing. Then we took that same circuitry and applied it to two other pedals, which are derived from old bits of studio gear. So there's the MEQ driver, which is based on a Pultec Studio EQ. These are bits of gear that I think the audience might be less familiar with. So the Pultec Studio EQs are these tube-based passive EQs from the 50s that are famous for having just like quite broad musical EQ curves and a kind of subtle saturation. The kind of thing that people just put them in the chain doing nothing because they make stuff sound better. A bit like what you were saying with the 1176.
Yep.
So we took that and turned the mid-band from it into a mid-boost and overdrive for guitar, and then did a similar thing with our DCX boost pedal, which takes a UA 610 preamp and kind of reimagines it as a guitar pedal. And both of those also feature the adaptive circuitry that adjusts the high end in proportion to clipping. So you can run a nice warm driven tone, but it gets nice and sparkly as you clean up. And, you know, that's the kind of the USP of those things.
Well, I think you guys nailed it. And the most resonant thing I heard you say there was it would have been so much easier to just make a clone. and you unfairly get put in this box of like, oh, it's just a clone. And especially with the clones, right? Because I mean, my gosh, like everybody and their brother has a clone now. It's gotten to the level of just ridiculous. But I remember the first time I played the Halcyon Gold and was sort of setting expectations like, okay, this is going to be a clone, but you know, maybe there's something different. But when I flipped that adaptive circuitry, it was incredible because I also, you know, so many people use clones as a clean boost and I enjoy them that way. They're great. But I also really enjoy a pretty cranked driven tone from a clone. And I think you guys even talk about this in the literature, but you know, as you raise the gain on a clone, it sort of narrows that frequency band as the gain knob progresses. It's an interesting, you know, dynamic of that circuit. And that's something that always drove me crazy because you could never have both, right? Like you either had it set up as a clean boost and it's a little bit more open, or you set it up to grind and then you get the mid hump, although a little higher on the frequency spectrum than a tube screamer. But the adaptive circuitry was like, man, I'm playing a totally new pedal. And quite honestly, even though that pedal, I know it's modeled off a clone, I would not put that in a category of a clone because it makes it so different. Just that flick of the switch. And again, if you guys listening have never played one, there's three settings. You've got the standard setting, which makes it just like a Klon or a Tube Screamer or any of the other variants that John mentioned. The second setting is a little bit of adaptive, and the third is the most adaptive. I like the third setting, the most adaptive, because it's just incredible. You can play, you've got the gain cranked up, a little bit of volume control, a little bit of hand dynamics, and it's like all of this high end and low end just comes back. So, I mean, kudos to you guys. I really think you came up with something really, really unique in the marketplace.
Oh, thanks very much. Yeah, and I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm bashing on the clone guys because I'm not at all. There's people out there making awesome clones that are probably closer to the real thing than ours. But there's so many people doing that and doing it very well that it's not something we wanted to get involved in. It's much more up our street to find out what we could do differently about it. And the thing you're saying about the mid hump was one of the real revelations. Like, yeah, you can kind of have your cake and eat it with the two clon sounds, really.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me throw our last poll out here as we're getting kind of closer to the end. One thing I want to ask everybody is just, for instance, have you ever used high-end studio effects in your rig before? And so this could be, higher end effects like the Origin line. Have you used rack gear? Are you waiting to try that out? Yeah, wow, looks like yeah. So the vast majority are interested in getting into that, but haven't really gotten there yet. It looks like about 25% of our audience is saying, yeah, that they have been using high-end studio effects in the past as well. So yeah, interesting stuff here. And for me, that's one thing I really like about the Origin line. If you're interested in getting your hands and getting exposure to what does some of this really high-end stuff sound like. For instance, again, 1176, absolute staple of studio classics. But not everybody's got, a couple of grand to go drop on that piece of gear. And even if you did, you've got to mount it in a rack. It's not something you can carry with you to the gig. So I think that is a really unique sort of entry point with Origin, is that your product line allows people to get access to that. And that's one of the things that we really enjoy about having you guys at Buy or Borrow. I mean, our whole mission and vision is allowing musicians easy, affordable access to get gear so that they can just focus their time and energy on creating their art and not thinking about, going bankrupt. So, the fact that you can access Origin pedals for, $39 a month, I think is pretty cool. Well, in closing out here, John, I'd love to just kind of zoom in and talk a little bit more around, how your pedals are being applied. And it would be awesome maybe if you could give us some examples of some artists who are using your gear today and sort of what approaches they're taking in their own rigs with your gear.
Um, what specifically were you thinking of? Just like signal chain stuff, different stuff problems they've got to solve, things like that?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I know, like, for instance, I think John Mayer is a big fan of Cali 76. I'm sure everybody loves to hear about his rig. I think Rabea Masad as well is using some of your guys' stuff. I mean, I know there's a lot of really high-end artists that are putting your stuff to work.
He's an interesting one, actually, Rabea. He's got really involved with the Neural DSP Quad Cortex and is he's got his own line of plugins with Neural DSP, and he kind of runs his whole rig around that modeler. And interestingly enough, last time I looked, one of the very few analog pedals that he still has plugged in externally of that device is the Origin Effects Cali 76 Stacked Edition, which I think is quite a compliment. I think he has that, maybe a fuzz, and that crazy microcosm granular looper thing, and everything else is done. It may have changed now, or I might have misremembered the details, but there was about 3 pedals, and we were one of them. One of the things that he considers can't be done inside the modeler. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty big compliment. Another one that was pretty good was we had the bass rig pedals, which are the bass amp recreation pedals. that also have a DI with a cab sim. About a week before they launched, a couple of years ago, session bassist and musical director Adam Blackstone used one for the Super Bowl.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's it. Like, how many people has that broadcast to? Sort of like a billion people across the world or something, and they're all hearing the straight DI tone from one of our bass amp recreations. So those are two very different ways you can use them. And then there's a load of other players who are just running something like a Revival Drive Compact into backline Fender amps and using it more like a typical amp in a box drive pedal, and using the post drive EQ controls that it has to just kind of work with whatever's on the gig. So it's sort of, yeah, there's all kinds of stuff out there making different differences in different kinds of artists' rigs.
I would love to zoom in particularly, and this will be the last point here before we wrap up. You know, you mentioned Rubea and how he's got this sort of digital analog hybrid. We've talked about that a lot. In fact, we had Justin Bryant from Two Notes Engineering on with us just a couple of weeks ago to talk about, you know, how digital and analog come together. I would love to hear your thoughts around how you're seeing your products be sort of in a hybrid setup like that. And I'll kind of preface it with this. One of the ways I love to use the Revival Drive is by setting it to the DI mode. So basically, you know, like amp sim kind of mode, and then running it into my DAW, which is Logic. And then I use Two Notes Genome. And so I do all my cabs in there, but I'm using the sound of, you know, the pedal to sort of be that sort of quote unquote amp modeler. But I think you guys are really unique in that, you know, so many people are doing that in the box or in something like Neural, but you sort of got the ability to do both, right? Like you could run that thing as a drive standalone. You could run it front of house. You can run it into a DI. You can run it with digital. So I just love to hear your thoughts on how you see digital and analog coming together with the way your products can be applied.
Well, I actually use my Revival drives in the same way that you do. Um, I, any gigs I do these days tend to be on in-ears. Certainly any recording I ever do is direct, and I use the Two Notes Cab M. So yeah, same as you. I think the thing with integrating digital and analog products is everybody who's using digital gear tends to have some things that some effects they don't really mind about, and are just okay with whatever's in that box. And then there'll be some particular part of the process that they might kind of accept a compromise on, or be looking for a solution to, but haven't found anything practical, where it's like, oh, everything else is fine, but I'm just really not quite satisfied with the insert name of effects here in digital. I think it's only right in analog. So for some people, that will be the amp blocks. For some people, that will be the compressors. For some people, that will be the drives, whatever. So what I would hope happens with Origin stuff is that anybody who's doing that will see that there's you know, the missing piece of the puzzle in an Origin pedal, and then they can kind of fly that in, whether that's a compressor in front and then you just hit the digital unit and everything's fine, or all of the surrounding pedals in the rig are virtual pedals in the digital realm, and then they've just got a Revival drive plugged in the sort of effects loop of their Helix or something, because they found it to be more convincing than the amp blocks in the Helix. It's just that kind of thing. It's just working out where your priority is and just flying one or two things in analog in there and making do with all the other stuff that you're less fussy about.
Well said, man. Well said. I'm the same. And for me, it's always, you know, things like amp or overdrive tones. It's gotten really good in the box. And I would argue, you know, some of the amp models from Neural and Line 6 are awesome. But the overdrive effects, it's not quite there. The feel isn't there. And then delay, I get kind of picky about delay. I'm kind of a delay snob, right? Like I really love the sound of my old Memory Man, or, you know, if I want that analog sound. Although I will say that the Helix line, especially after some of their more recent updates, some of those delay tones are just spectacular. I honestly, I probably could not tell you the difference if I was blindfolded, you know, between some of the ones in there, but certainly drive tones, and I think compression as well. You know, if you're just looking
Yeah.
for something really standard and sort of utilitarian, a lot of the compressors in the box are fine, but if you really want something that's going to add a little color and the harmonics and the saturation, there's just no replacement for analog. But I think you nailed it on the head, which is find those pieces and parts that you feel as yourself as an artist matter. Pull those out, find a way to bring it together. And there's never been a better time to have the ability to create those kind of rigs. I mean, even a decade ago, man, like, people would have those crazy, like Bradshaw systems, a decade, 2 decades ago. And now, I mean, you can literally have an HX stomp and a couple of well-picked analog pedals, and you've got a world-class rig. It's a really great time to be alive as a guitar player.
Well, and that's exactly that situation you just described is exactly where Origin kind of came from, which is there's loads of things that have been done well enough. And there's loads of things that have been done more than well enough. But also, there are people out there who are just super fussy about certain things. And the staff of Origin Effects are included in that list of people. So it's like, it doesn't matter if things are adequate. We're trying to kind of resolve the issues of serious fussiness for people who've got strong opinions about certain bits of gear where other stuff won't do. And I'll just add as a side note, one of the guys at the Origin Effects office has a quad cortex, and we tried to capture the Halcyon green using the quad, the function where it can capture the sound of pedals, and it didn't really do the adaptive thing.
Yeah.
So there you go. Adaptive circuitry only works in analog.
Yeah, I can totally see it, because again, it is mind blowing. And again, it's a lot like compression, where in my opinion, it's something you feel more than you hear, but it's almost the same way that your eyes kind of light up when you first play a compressor and be like, oh, wow, like I can do that with my fingers. The same thing was with the adaptive circuitry. It is literally one of the things I think is the coolest in your lineup. And I love the Cali 76, like great pedal. But for me, the ones I get most hyped about, it's the Halcyon Gold. Like that is the one that if I had like a desert island, Origin pedal, maybe the Revival Drive, that'd be tough because I'm such a Marshall guy. But both of those just do a really, really great job of recreations. Well, I know yeah, go, man.
I was just going to say, I've kind of noticed that everything I've talked about are all these sort of slightly intangible concepts about, oh, if you play like this, then you'll enjoy that, or these things have to be felt rather than heard, or all this kind of stuff, which is actually a really good reason to have Buy or Borrow on board, because it actually allows people to go and find out what all the hype's about before kind of committing to spending quite a lot of money on some online order from halfway across the country. So yeah, it's a good service you guys are providing, especially for pedals like ours, where it is in the very nerdy details and sort of got to be tried to be believed. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, John. That's really kind of you, and that is literally why we exist. And this all grew out of my out of my own passion, because I have been that guy. I am the nerd that likes the details, and have had many challenging conversations with my spouse around, oh, well, this is why I bought this, right? Or, oh, this is why I lost money when I sold this. But it is what it is. But we're really happy to have you guys on board, because I do believe it is one of those things that you have to feel to really understand a lot of your products. Well, we've got a couple of minutes left. If there are any final questions that anyone would like to throw over to John, if you just use the Q&A feature on the bottom, and we can log those in and get those over to John. And while we're waiting, so I know we talked about your pedal board, John. What's your go-to axe, man? Like what I can see you've got a lot of guitars behind you there.
Telecaster. If you can't do it with a Telecaster, it's not worth doing. It's got all three sounds. You know what I mean? What more do you need? The bridge pickup does rock, country, and pop. The neck pickup does blues and jazz, and the middle pickup does anything else that you need. And it doesn't go out of tune, and you can knock it over and tread on it, and it'll still work.
You can knock it over and tread on it, or you could hit someone with it like Keith Richards did, and it's still in tune and it keeps playing. But yeah, I think we have a lot in common, because that right there is a go-to for me. And if I had again one desert island guitar, I think I would agree. It's a Tele because you can just kind of do anything. All right, so we got a comment or a question in from Jason. Telecaster just feels right to palm mute for me. I feel uncomfortable with strats. I'm with you too, Jason, and especially if you've got a strat with a floating bridge, which, as God intended, if you're floating it, you really can't palm mute or rest your palm on that. But yeah, I agree. Mine's got the kind of the old school, ashtray style, which I like because,
Yeah,
it's got that
same
extra
here.
little lip. Yeah, the extra little lip to get your hand on as well.
The
So
way I describe it is if a Telecaster was a superhero, it'd be Batman. It doesn't actually have any superpowers, but it still saves the day just as well as any of the other ones.
that is very well said, man. I think that is a great analogy. Great analogy. Awesome. Well, I think that's it as far as the questions we've got rolling in. John, man, this has been really, really great. I appreciate you taking time to join. And for everyone that's tuned in as well, we're going to post this on YouTube probably next 24 or 48 hours. We'll send out a link to you guys if you wanted to go back and watch on demand, zoom in on any parts that you may have missed or may want to go deeper on. We'll get that out to you guys, and I think we'll have a blog to go along with this as well. So again, John, man, super, super thankful and blessed to have you guys on with us as partners and really, really happy. Oh, actually, you know what? Looks like we got another one coming in. Okay. It's just some of our folks just again saying thank you. So Jason says, hey, thank you. Now I'm interested in trying out Origin effects pedals. That's awesome, man. I'm glad
There
that
we
we
go.
were able to, yeah, I'm glad we were able to kind of get some folks hyped up about it here. So anyway, thanks again. I'll post the link, and John, I'll send it over to you as well if you guys want to distribute on your end. But take care, everyone.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks very much. Cheers.
Cheers.